the US had, on the 29th of November, indicted an Indian national, Nikhil Gupta, in an alleged plot to murder Khalistan terror supporter Pannun in the United States. Biden administration officials say they are taking up the matter very seriously.
We have noted at the most senior levels of this government, the Secretary of State has raised this directly with his foreign counterpart, that we take this issue very seriously. They told us they would conduct an investigation. They have publicly announced an investigation, and now we'll wait to see the results of the investigation, but it's something we take very seriously.
However, India has repeatedly told the US it expects the United States to take action against terrorists and gangsters in the US, while promising to investigate the issue raised by the State Department.
That insofar as the US is concerned, certain inputs were given to us as part of our security cooperation with the United States. Those inputs were of concern to us because they related to the nexus of organized crime, trafficking, and other matters. So, because it has a bearing on our own national security, it was decided to institute an inquiry into the matter, and an inquiry committee has been constituted.
India is keeping its powder dry to expose US double standards in dealing with elements like Pannun, who use American soil to target India unchecked. Bureau Report, India Today.
And make sure they decide about their future.
So the US wants India to probe the alleged murder plot and the Indian link, the murder attempt and the Indian link. The State Department has shared some details with India, and apart from the US Deputy National Security Advisor, at multiple levels, India and the US remain engaged on the progress of investigations in India. But what about India's concerns that the US soil is being used for an anti-India agenda, and that Khalistani elements have targeted the Indian mission, the consulate in San Francisco, arson cases, other cases? What will the United States do? Listen in to the spokesperson of the Ministry of External Affairs, Arinder Bagchi, on the forthcoming visit of the FBI Director Christopher Wray to India.
So as part of this ongoing bilateral cooperation, visit by the FBI Director is in the works, is being held, but let them confirm the exact things. Details of this visit has been worked out with the US side over the course of the last few months. And as I said, I wouldn't like to confirm the specific timeline for that. That I would leave to the US, I would direct it to the US Embassy or the agencies for the specifics of this visit. But yes, there's something that is in the works.
So India has initiated an inquiry on the allegations made by the United States of America. But the fact remains, US is also India's strategic partner. What action has the US taken, if any, on India's security concerns with Khalistani terrorists targeting the Indian consulate in San Francisco, or Pannun threatening Indian diplomats, or Khalistan terror gangs threatening people in India? Strategic partnership clearly cannot be a one-way street, or is it? Joining me on this special broadcast is Professor Brahma Chilani, former advisor to the National Security Council. He's a very well-respected security analyst. Also with me is Shashikant, former DGP of Punjab. Tara Kartha is former member of the National Security Council Secretariat. And Terry Milevsky is author, Blood for Blood, 50 Years of Global Khalistan Project. I want to begin by asking you, Professor Chilani, US very concerned about this plot to target a US citizen. But does Pannun being a US citizen outweigh his terror links and threats that he issues from US soil, sir, in your appreciation?
You raise a good question. The question is, why is the Indian government not openly expressing concern over the failure of US agencies to act against individuals like Pannun, who are repeatedly making terrorist threats against Indian targets? Pannun went from threatening action against Canadians of Hindu faith, then he made threats against Air India and the New Delhi airport, and now in his latest terrorist threat, he has threatened to target the Indian Parliament. All this is happening from American soil. This man is a dual national of American and Canadian citizenship. Still, the fact is that he's largely based in New York, and the US should be acting against someone who is openly making terrorist threats. Now, the Indian government was very prompt in instituting a high-level inquiry into the US allegation over a murder for hire plot, a failed plot. How promptly the Indian government set up such an inquiry? Shouldn't India be pressing the US to set up an inquiry into why American agencies are shielding some key Khalistani elements? One such element was responsible in staging the murder in India of a famous Punjabi singer,
Yes.
Moosewala.
Sidhu Moosewala, absolutely.
Several of these guys, the prominent ones, were involved in the arson attack on the Indian consulate in San Francisco in July. And that was the second attack on the Indian consulate in San Francisco this year. First came in March, then in July. And yet, these people are able to operate with impunity from American soil. And I think the time has come for the Indian government
Yes.
to do it in a very polite way, but it has to raise its voice as to why the US government is allowing such elements to act with impunity from American soil.
And these
We
are
were
not just
quick-
words. These are not just words. We've put out those images of the arson at the Indian consulate in San Francisco so that the world can see this is what the US is turning a blind eye to. Is this free speech? Terry Milsky, you've dealt with the subject for a very long time. You've seen it up close in Canada. But I want to understand from you, why would the US or why would Canada not take action against these Khalistani terrorists and terrorist supporters on their soil when they claim to be India's close partners, strategic partners?
Well, you said it, they claim to be, but in practice, they have not been. Both Canada and the United States have taken a who cares attitude to Indian complaints that we have failed to crack down on Khalistani threats. At the same time, I think that this is the issue that India wants to talk about with Director Ray, but it's not necessarily the issue that Director Ray wants to talk about. He wants to talk about the legitimacy or otherwise of India plotting murder on US soil. That's his issue. But India has many complaints that the US and Canada both need to answer. You know, for example, that of Pannun's background. You know that Pannun was recently, for example, this is just an example, offering cash rewards for the home addresses of Indian diplomats in Canada and elsewhere. Now, that seems to be deliberately endangering those diplomats, which he is also calling killers. Then, of course, you mentioned the Air India case, where very recently Pannun was heard saying that it would be risking your life
Yes.
to travel on Air India. Well, he said, "Oh, I'm just only asking for a boycott of Air India." Why would a boycott endanger your life exactly? I think that that's not just that sounded like a threat to me. Then there's a long history of Pannun's videos. I'll just mention one, "I Am Dilawa," in which he puts himself in the shoes of the suicide bomber who killed the Chief Minister of Punjab, Bayant Singh, in 1995. Blew himself up along with the Chief Minister and 16 innocent bystanders.
Yes.
Well, he made a video about that in which he featured a portrait of the then Chief Minister, Captain Amarinder Singh, being blasted with machine gun fire. That sounded like a threat to me. And it goes on. And of course, the theme that runs through Mr. Pannun's activities is the glorification of terrorist mass murderers.
Yes.
He has named the referendum. Oh, he's all for democracy, he says. He's for ballots, not bullets. That's a quote. Well, in that case, why is he naming the referendum campaign in Canada after the worst mass murderer in Canadian history, Talvinder Singh Parmar, the author of the Kanishka bombing of 1985,
Absolutely.
who lost 331 innocent civilians. So my point is that India, to me, has a very legitimate case to say to both the US and Canada, what are you doing? Why are you letting this man run around making these threats and behaving like this? And Director Ray has got an answer. He's going to say, well, that's all very interesting, and we're happy to talk to you about what more can be done about this. But
Yes.
Remember, I'm here to talk about India's plot to murder this man on U.S. soil. That is going too far. And in that sense, we're set up for a dialogue of the deaf. I want to talk about this. You want to talk about that. When are we going to make a deal?
So there has to be middle ground. If there is a plot, show us evidence. But has India given any evidence to the United States of America or to Canada? And I'll come to that question. But Tara Garata, I want to understand from you, ma'am, does Pannu being a US citizen actually outweigh all the aspects about his terrorist links? All the aspects that both Professor Brahmachalani and Terry Milsky so aptly put in public domain?
No, certainly not. In fact, just look at the FBI charter. Okay, they say it's our duty to uphold the US Constitution. Also, that's one. Second, in terrorism, and here I'm reading out from their charter, the Bureau works closely with its partners to neutralize terrorist cells and operatives here in the United States. That's its charter, to
Yes.
help dismantle extremist networks worldwide. Is the Sikhs for Justice worldwide? It is. Is it operating in Pakistan? It is. Is it operating in the UK? It is. Has it been involved in specific terrorist activity? Certainly. And if you want more details, there is the 2020 NIA charge sheet. I mean, just go through that. It is not just, this man's activities are at a level which is really surprising. He even writes to the Chinese ambassador accusing India of attacking the Chinese embassy in Pakistan. I mean, look at the range of his activities, right?
Yes.
And then you say you can't act against him. I'm sorry, that is your charter.
So the FBI director, and I want to understand, Professor Chalani, if the FBI director comes to India and says, I want to talk about the hire for murder plot in the United States of America, and India says, we want to talk about Pannu's terror links, does this become a dialogue of the deaf, or is there a middle ground that both countries must come to, Professor Chalani?
Gaurav, the larger issue is this. The US policy focus is on how it can derive strategic benefits in the Indo-Pacific by partnering with India, not on how it can contribute to bolstering India's security. The presumption in Washington is that by helping to advance US interests in the Indo-Pacific, India would be contributing to its own security, even if the US modernizes Pakistan's F-16 fleet, it destabilizes Myanmar and targets Bangladesh, and shelters and shields Sikh extremists wanted in India on terrorism charges. In Washington's perception, being America's strategic partner means being guided by the US. But India is not going to be guided by the US.
Yes.
The message is clear to Washington that that might be your standard approach, but India is no ordinary strategic partner. And if you want India's cooperation, you have to treat India with respect on an equal basis and address India's concerns. India may have taken a very soft approach to the US allegations. The US has raised those allegations at the highest level, possibly, with the Secretary of State saying it in public, and according to US media reports, even President Biden took up the matter with Prime Minister Modi. So India's response may have been low-key, but India has left the US in no doubt that unless its concerns are addressed, there can be no genuine counter-terrorism cooperation, because the FBI director is coming to India for a larger dialogue that stretches from cyber security to counter-terrorism.
Yes.
But if issues like this, the role of Khalistan extremists on American soil, making terrorist threats against India or staging killings in India, if that issue is not addressed, how can there be larger cooperation?
Absolutely. And that's the question. But is there evidence, and does India have evidence that will hold in a court of law? I want to bring in Mr. Shashikant, former Director General of the Punjab Police. Sir, you've seen Khalistan terror up close and personal. You've combated Khalistan terror, but this overseas support to Khalistan terror, has India not succeeded in sensitizing either the US or Canada adequately to compel them to take action? In your view, do Khalistani terrorists and their supporters in the US and Canada still pose a threat to India?
Well, I don't know the exact definition of what sensitizing means. India has sent as many as 26 requests, 26 letters to Canada and to United States, giving them evidence of what these guys are doing there in Canada and in US. And they have given names, they have given proofs, because I know that once upon a time, I had also made such papers and given out sufficient proof. That's why I say I fail to understand what's the definition of perfect proof and absolute proof, etc., etc. And now here I'll just say one more thing. We have an international convention on diplomatic relations. We have several conventions on and charters on terrorism. All of them clearly state whatever is happening as on date. None of these two governments, particularly Canada and United States, have been taking any action. If anybody, India has been prompt enough to take cognizance of their request and institute this inquiry committee.
Yes.
And I'm sure that the CBI director, the FBI director is coming, they'll certainly sort it out and look into it. But I say this is about the time that India should also take up this particular issue, because bilateral relations can't be one-sided. They have to be absolutely they have to be both-sided. And one more thing, for a while I had worked in the External Affairs Ministry, also looking after security of all the missions all over the globe. And whenever there was a meeting and we used to take such issues of Khalistan and this and that, the response of the concerned countries used to be, hey, let's first talk about the things on which we agree. We'll talk about other issues later on. Again, what it is, it's again a one-way channel, one-way traffic. No, sir, it is not. It's about time that these countries, we respect them, we want them, and we value them. But it's about time that take cognizance of this particular thing, what's happening.
It's about time. It's about time. Terry Milsky, in your appreciation, has this message gone loud and clear, whether to Canada or to the United States of America? India's concerns will have to be taken on board. It cannot be a strategic relationship, cannot be a one-way street.
Well, so far I have to tell you that I think they still don't get it. I mean, I don't think Indians generally appreciate that. They didn't follow very much what was going on in Canada back in the day, at the heyday of the Sikh insurgency, and most of them aren't even aware of how far Canada, for example, went to ignore Indian warnings about Khalistani terrorism. I mean, I'll just give you one more example of how not to take it seriously. There was an explicit warning from Air India to Canada, specifically to Toronto Airport and to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. That was just 3 weeks before the Air India bombing, the Kanishka bombing of June 1985, which said, we have intelligence. We have specific intelligence that these terrorists are trying to plant bombs on Air India planes, which of course is exactly what happened. And you know what the Royal Canadian Mounted Police said? They said, oh, those Indians, they're always complaining. They're just trying to get more free security. And they put this telex on the shelf. They never even gave it to their partners in the security agencies. That's the standard of how Canada has reacted historically to these kinds of threats from, and it's inexcusable. But now India has created a distraction from these issues. India could certainly make a case that Canada and the United States have ignored explicit warnings like that one. I could name a whole list. But now there's this giant distraction. If you are plotting murder in the United States, the FBI doesn't like that. They've got a very serious case. India has to give up something in order to get what it wants on getting more action on Indian concerns. They have to give up something, and that means giving up some admission that, well, okay, maybe it was a rogue operation.
Okay.
We didn't approve it, but yeah, there was a Indian government employee involved in plotting the assassination of Pannun, and that won't do. That's not legal.
Okay. Tarakarada, is that how you also look at it? That the FBI will not, or the US will not take very kindly if there is any truth in the allegations that they make. All that evidence has to stand scrutiny in a court of law. But how do you see this? Do you see this as American pressure tactics trying to wean India away from Russia, or you think that this is far more serious than that?
At one level, I should tell you, India-US relations are at a level which I have never seen before. Like we are cooperating across multiple areas.
Yes.
In fact, even including recently you take issues on innovation, which to me is a very dear subject to me, because that is the core of Atmanirbhar, right? So that's separate. But I should like to see someone in India threatening President Biden and what Washington would do next. Would they sit quiet? Within 24 hours, they will be demanding an inquiry. They'll be demanding what is going on, who is it, the entire history. So what you do, if someone threatens my diplomats, I am fully entitled to know who it is and what action have you taken. One. And if this is, like he said, part of the conventions on diplomacy. Apart from that, is your own, terrorism, your commitment to countering terrorism. Also, there's one other aspect.
Yes.
In terms of this person who was arrested, right? To me, coming from my background, it's a charade.
Yep.
Right?
He's anyway a drug peddler. He's anyway a gun runner, and working with DEA. DEA, somebody like David Coleman Headley, a terrorist, was working with DEA.
Exactly. Absolutely, yes. So if that is the level of things they've got, I mean, it is like, I think Terry actually says, it's a distraction from the fact that you did nothing to stop these people. Absolutely nothing.
Is that also your appreciation, Professor Brahmachalani? How should India be reacting to this? Because there are some in our country who are saying, oh my God, America is saying that Indians were involved in a plot to kill an American citizen. That American citizen, even if that were true, I mean, I have no idea. But that American citizen is a terrorist, a designated terrorist in India, and India has repeatedly asked America to take action against him. Professor Chilani.
There are two things, Gaurav. It's becoming increasingly apparent that when Trudeau made his bombshell allegation on the floor of the Canadian Parliament, he was being guided by US inputs. Very much the US was behind Trudeau's allegation against India. Now, if you look at that 15-page indictment in the Pannun case, it's that indictment is such a naive naive charge sheet. It clearly spells out that they were tracking this individual from May, that is before Niger was killed.
Yes.
So clearly, the US was very much involved in instigating Trudeau to make his allegation against India. When that allegation became a damn squib because Trudeau failed to present any kind of evidence. He failed to declassify the intelligence on the basis of which he was making that allegation. The Americans then decided in November, months after they actually were tracking this alleged plot, to come after India. Now, that's one aspect. The other aspect, which is even more troubling, is that there is a long-standing connection between intelligence or security agencies in the Anglosphere and prominent overseas-based Khalistanis. For example, after Niger was killed, FBI agents individually went and warned prominent Khalistanis living in the US, especially in California, to step up their security. Second, according to Canadian media reports, Niger guy had a nexus with Canada's main intelligence agency. The main Canadian intelligence agency's officers were meeting with Niger on a regular basis in the months leading up to his killing. Now, nobody is asking, what were these connections all about? Why were Canadian intelligence officers meeting with Niger on a regular basis? 2 or 3 times a week, according to his son,
Yes.
as quoted in the Vancouver Sun.
Yes.
Now, this nexus between agencies and prominent Khalistanis is something that India needs to seek answers about.
Absolutely. It's time for India to seek answers from the Americans and the Canadians instead of FBI seeking answers from us. And it has to be a two-way street. But okay, both Terry and Tara have their hands up. Terry, you go first, sir.
Just very briefly, thank you. On the question of Mr. Nijja's contacts with CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, remember that the question is really just exactly the opposite. If CSIS was not keeping close touch with Mr. Nijja, they should have been fired. The CSIS absolutely should have been keeping a very close eye on Mr. Nijja, who was a number 2 to Pannun and a very important figure in the referendum movement in Canada, and had a lot of connections that were kind of suspicious. So if CSIS was not regularly calling on him to have a chat, to be friendly, to find out what he knows, then they should have been fired. There's absolutely a good reason why CSIS was in touch with him. Now they did.
Is
yes,
it okay in Canada, if I may very briefly, is it okay in Canada for a citizen to be photographed with an AK-47 assault rifle? Is that kosher? Is it okay for a citizen in Canada who's a plumber, to be traveling to Pakistan and meeting with terrorists? Is that acceptable? I mean, is that what Canadian citizens do?
Certainly not, although his meeting, for example, in Pakistan with terrorists doesn't break any Canadian law. It's not in Canada's jurisdiction. All I'm saying is that it's not necessarily suspicious that CSIS was keeping in close touch with him. That's exactly what I would like them to be doing.
Fair enough. Okay, Tarat Karta, ma'am, you wanted to come in, and then Mr. Shashikant.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, just to add to that, don't forget that the entire Kanishka bombing tapes were erased by the CCIS. If you remember that, the Canadians, all that went on. But to sort of I just want to moderate this a little. See, the India-US relationship is going places. It's really, really going places.
Absolutely.
There are a lot of people who want to sabotage that. They are in the US, they are outside the US. And please believe me, there are a lot of people within the US who want to sabotage this. And I've seen this up close. So when you talk of, I think the Canadian Prime Minister kind of took the whole thing to another level, because the US was initially acting very properly. They told us quietly, this is what happened. And the whole thing would have proceeded without anybody knowing anything if the Canadian Prime Minister hadn't blown the whole thing up in front. Right? So that is at one level. And I think the administration has been pretty low-key on this. They have, publicly speaking, they've been pretty low-key. So I would, but nonetheless, that doesn't at all absolve them of not taking action against the Khalistan.
Look at that arson in our consulate and the inaction in the United States of America. That should be completely unacceptable. But Mr. Shashikant, India and the US, very close strategic partners. This relationship is going great guns, and it should improve, especially when we're getting all the technology that we require and so on. But I'd like to take you back to Mr. B. Raman's book, former Additional Secretary in the Research and Analysis Wing. He'd written that Richard Nixon in the US and Yahya Khan in Pakistan fanned the Khalistan fire. That the United States, that time, sent weapons for Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale through Pakistan. Now,
that's a fact. That's a fact. At that point of time, I was in the Intelligence Bureau. So I know it's a fact. And the point that I want to make here is that here we are talking of one person, of American citizen, who they claim that is being threatened by some Indian. What about our persons, our nationals traveling in aircraft and being threatened that the entire plane will be blown up? And second point is for consideration. Now, what is happening in Canada and in the United States? Canadian government, in a way, is a minority government. They want to support one particular group. And what's happening in the United States, that there is a clear-cut shift. There's some of the even your Democrats are going towards inching towards the other party. So that is the reason probably that they want to stabilize their own countries, their own rule and this and that. That they are doing it. But again, last thing I want to say, just a quote. एक शेर था उसका, इनका खून खून है, हमारा खून पानी है. Thank you.
No, you're absolutely right. And Terry, the point that Mr. Shashikant, as former DGP of Punjab, is making, American lives and American blood cannot be more precious, more valuable than Indian blood and Indian lives. So, this isn't a white man's world where others will play second fiddle to US interests or Canadian interests in the 21st century, sir. How does that message get across to the administration, whether it's Justin Trudeau's administration or Joe Biden's administration?
Well, I think this current flare-up is going to educate a lot of people, don't you? I mean, I think that a lot more people realize that, for example, there's a whole lot of hypocrisy in the Western approach to this, that too many Westerners take the attitude that, of course, if we go out and rub out terrorists all around the world, it's perfectly fine. But if the Indians do it or even threaten to do it, that's just terrible. And I'm sure that the Indian side will be making that point to Mr. Ray today. The only problem is that that argument, it helps you get through the day. It makes a difference, I guess, but it's not conclusive, because none of the Western democracies, not Canada, not the United States, are going to accept that that makes it okay for India to come into Canada or the US and plot murder. No argument is going to get past that problem. So India has to make a clean breast of it and say, okay, here's how we're going to deal with it. It's not just set up a panel and they report, 3 years from now when we've all forgotten this. It's got to be taken seriously. Somebody has to be held to account. Mr. CC1, the nom de guerre of the alleged mastermind of this scheme, who was an Indian government employee and apparently still is, if that person is, if found guilty, going to have to pay, even if quietly he is released and given a gold watch for his retirement when the cameras are looking elsewhere.
But does that also mean that the same will happen in the US and in Canada when Indian lives are threatened? Because it clearly has to be a two-way street, Professor Brahmachalani. Is the US, in your view, looking at this as perhaps some kind of pressure tactics to wean us away from Russia? And will the impact perhaps jolt them into a hard reality?
Well, I think what we are seeing is that to some extent is India's fault. For example, if you take the Canada-India relationship, India let Canada off the hook over the Air India bombing.
Absolutely.
For more than 2 decades, Canada did not even institute a commission of inquiry. And in the interim, clinching evidence was wiped out. Today, we're talking about accountability. Did Canada hold this guy, Talvinder Parmar, accountable? Was he held to account for the Air India bombings? 2 different Canadian inquiries labeled him as the mastermind of the Air India twin bombings. But he was killed in Punjab when he tried to enter India from Punjab, from Pakistan. He tried to enter India, and that's why he was killed. But the Canadians did not hold him to account. Similarly, you've seen all these attacks, for example, on Indian missions, the consulate attacks in Francisco, 2 of them. Nobody has been held to account. The only silver lining in all this is that for the first time, thanks to Trudeau's allegation in Canadian Parliament, and now the US raking up this entire issue of an alleged plot, attention is now focusing on Canadian and American Sikh extremists, or using American and Canadian soil to engage in terrorist activity against India. And I think this certainly is not what Washington and Ottawa expected.
Oh, absolutely. They perhaps expected India to roll over and play dead. And Terry Milsky, that clearly is not happening in what is often described as New India or Naya Bharat. We demand accountability, for Air India Kanishk bombing, for Khalistani terrorists using Canada as a base to carry out their gangster activities in India, where Indian singers are being killed or Indians are being killed. Same with the United States of America. I mean, do Canada and the US want to be seen as safe havens for Khalistan terror, the way Pakistan is seen as a safe haven for radical Islamist terror, sir?
Well, until now, they haven't taken that seriously. I think it's absolutely true that both Canada and the United States have looked the other way because, hey, it's not our problem. These crimes are happening in India. We're not in the line of fire, so we don't need to worry about it. Of course, now we really do have to worry about it because these chickens are coming home to roost. We had a case very recently in Canada of a gangland shootout in Alberta where an 11-year-old boy was killed. And not by accident, but by the gun was aimed at him. It was the son of a gangster who was wiped out by another gang. So, I mean, so now Canadians are sitting up, and I think finally, after 40 years of looking the other way, they're paying attention. At least I hope so.
No, and we will make sure that we keep tracking that story very, very closely. Here on India Today, we will raise the issue of Khalistanis, of these terrorists on US soil and in Canada. To all my guests for joining me on this India Today special broadcast, many thanks. There's been a meltdown in Parliament, a virtual meltdown over Union Home Minister Amit Shah talking about Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru's historical blunders on Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. The Congress today taunted the Home Minister, dared the government to bring back POK by 2024 and take away all the votes. We bring you more in this report.
पाक ऑक्यूपाई कश्मीर की 24 सीटें, क्योंकि वो हमारा है, हमने रिजर्व रखी है मान्यवर 24 सीटों को.
The no-holds-barred roar by Home Minister Amit Shah, affirming India's claim on Pakistan-occupied Kashmir.
नेहरू के समय में जो ब्लंडर हुआ था, इसके कारण कश्मीर को भुगतना पड़ा.
The attack on Nehru that reminded Congress of the so-called Himalayan blunders by India's first Prime Minister. Shah sent out the message that India will never stop claiming Pak-occupied Kashmir.
जम्मू में पहले 37 सीटें थी, 37 सीटें थी. ये भी न्याय का सवाल है. जम्मू में पहले 37 सीटें थी, अब 43 हुई है, 43 हुई है. कश्मीर में पहले 46 थी, अब 47 हुई है. और पाक ऑक्यूपाई कश्मीर की 24 सीटें, क्योंकि वो हमारा है, हमने रिजर्व रखी है मान्यवर 24 सीटों को.
Then came the Nehru salvo.
नेहरू के समय में जो ब्लंडर हुआ था, इसके कारण कश्मीर को भुगतना पड़ा. सबसे बड़ी गलती जब हमारी सेना जीत रही थी, पंजाब का एरिया आते ही सीज फायर कर दिया गया और पाक ऑक्यूपाई कश्मीर का जन्म हुआ. अगर सीज फायर 3 दिन लेट होता तो पाक ऑक्यूपाई कश्मीर आज भारत का हिस्सा. तो चर्चा होगी.
The opposition saw red, with Congress defending Nehru and daring Shah to bring POK back.
पाकिस्तान को हराया था. अगर दम है, हिम्मत है, ये दोनों बहादुर हमारे देश की, जो हर वक्त बहादुरी की बात करते हैं, ये हमटी डमटी दोनों जाके POK छीन के हमारा कब्जे में लाए.
अभी जो हमले हो रहे हैं POK पर, के पर, तो सब के लिए जिम्मेवार है अमित शाह.
Farooq credited Nehru for stopping Pakistan from taking Poonch and Rajouri.
उस वक्त पुंछ और राजौरी को बचाने के लिए फौज को डाइवर्ट कर दिया गया कि पुंछ और राजौरी बच जाए. आज पुंछ और राजौरी आज भारत का हिस्सा है, उसी मेहरबानी से है.
158
The big face-off over POK sets a new government versus opposition coalition course before 2024. Bureau Report, India Today.
मैं देता हूं जवाब.